I, for one, am tired of the memorials to dead Jews. I'm tired of how good the world is and at expressing regret. I want them to stand up for living Jews and a living Jewish state.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish news syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. Today, we have a timely and fascinating conversation about American Jewish reactions to Israel's new government with Malcolm Hoenlein of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we'd love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. We also want you to be aware that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. I'm now offering a daily Top Story podcast so that I can share with you more news and analysis about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Israel has a new government, and it's clear that American Jews and the Biden administration aren't happy about it. The mainstream liberal Jewish groups have always been uncomfortable with the right-wing governments led by Benjamin Netanyahu that Israeli voters have a habit of electing. But liberal America's hair is on fire about his latest coalition, in which the religious Zionist parties Bezalel Smotrich and Otzma Yehudit's Itamar Ben-Gvir are members. The small anti-gay Noam faction, which was also elected on the same ticket with those other two, is also part of the government, but not in charge of a ministry. This has led to warnings and petitions, as well as a flood of op-eds from liberal Jews, as well as publications that were already hostile to Israel, like the New York Times, denouncing the new government and swearing to either have little to do with it or to act to pressure it to repudiate the security policies, as well as plans for judicial reform that Netanyahu's coalition was elected to implement. The question these attacks on the government before it even took office raises is whether what we're observing in these reactions is a sea change in the already fractious relationship between Israel and American Jewry, or whether these exchanges will soon blow over. Now, anyone who has been thinking clearly about the growing divide between Israelis and American Jews would have to be inclined to believe that this is no passing storm. The problems are clear. Israel is a center-right country, and American Jewry is an overwhelmingly liberal and increasingly inclined to believe that Zionism has, to their chagrin, produced a country that is the moral equivalent of the kind of conservative red state that they despise in America. The religious divide between the two Jewish tribes, with Americans overwhelmingly identifying with the non-Orthodox denominations, and with a quarter of Israelis voting for explicitly Orthodox political parties, and the secular majority still considering Orthodoxy the only valid form of Judaism. All this is fed into a growing sense that much of American Jewry is ready to enlist in the anti-Bibi resistance to the current Israeli government, not merely in solidarity with the leftist parties that lead the opposition to Netanyahu, but as part of an effort to treat the new coalition as illegitimate. By engaging in the kind of political hyperbole that is now the norm for American politics, in which red and blue state America no longer accept each other as having good motives and think of political opponents as enemies of democracy and all that is decent, many American Jews, echoing the Israeli opposition led by former interim Prime Minister Yair Lapid, are treating the democratically elected government of Israel as beyond the pale and the moral equivalent of the Islamist theocrats that tyrannize Iran. Under these circumstances, the existing tensions between the Biden administration and Netanyahu, as well as those between American and Israeli Jews, are about to boil over and create a breach that can't be easily fixed. But as gloomy as the forecast for U.S. Israel relations may currently be, there are, however, three reasons for a degree of optimism. One is that Netanyahu remains in charge in Israel. Though he is cordially despised by Biden and liberal American Jews, he remains a political master whose ability to manipulate and maneuver around his cabinet colleagues will likely prevent Smotrich and Ben-Gvir from doing any real damage to the alliance. It's highly unlikely that Netanyahu will let the government pass anything that would do real damage to relations with the diasporas, changing the law of return, whatever the arguments for such moves might be. Second, in the coming weeks, as Netanyahu's government rolls out its plans for judicial reform and acts as it was elected to do to protect Jewish rights and security against an upsurge in terrorism, it will be made clear that none of that is radical or anti democratic. The third reason is that despite the never ending incitement about the threat to democracy, the fact remains that this government was democratically elected and is acting to implement the will of the voters. As such, no fair minded American, and despite what you may think, there are quite a few of those left, will be able to accept the lies about Israel embracing fascism, let alone being racist. Still, with so many powerful voices working to convince Americans that Israel is no longer a democratic country, those who wish to help preserve the U.S. Israel relationship have their work cut out for them to answer these calumnies. And to discuss this subject with us, we're pleased to have with us someone who has been at the center of the effort to strengthen the ties between Americans and Israel. Malcolm Hoenlein, the vice chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, the coordinating body for 53 national Jewish organizations, is with us today. He was the founding executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater New York and the Greater New York Conference on Soviet Jewry, and appears regularly in the media and has lectured in venues around the world. Malcolm Hoenlein, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Well, Malcolm, thanks so much for joining us today. I want to start by asking you the top Jewish story, certainly for today, what we should think about the predictions about the new Israeli government, blowing up relations between Israel and American Jewry, as well as the Biden administration. There's a lot of hair on fire and pearl clutching right now. How seriously should we take that?
Look, we take the U.S. Israel relationship very seriously. We take the relation between Israel and the diaspora very seriously. So everything that impacts it should be taken seriously. However, I remember when Sharon got elected and we saw all of the forest burning, and using your analogy, and we saw it when Begin got elected, if you remember, and it was the courageous stands taken by then the chairman of the Conference of Presidents, Rabbi Alex Schindler, who was head of the Reform Movement, who said, let's give him a chance, and reached out to him. And the two became lifelong friends and worked together. And despite whatever political differences were assumed, it was Begin who made the deal with Sadat. It was Sharon who did Gaza disengagement. And I think the predictions that so often accompany governments, especially that seem to lean right, but even some that lean left, but because the media in Israel and elsewhere is oriented in certain directions, this panic that is being created is inappropriate. I think some of the statements made, I wish ministers often would refrain from sometimes making public comments, because they themselves encourage then some of the reactions that we have seen. And when people assume responsibility, their stands often change. It's very easy when you're out of power to be able to say things and to assert things because you're building constituencies, it's the political game. That's true here too. But once you're in a position, a ministerial position, other positions, reality sets in and moderates often more extreme stands. And most of all, Prime Minister Netanyahu is very experienced. He is going to control this government. He's not going to let people run off and do some of the things that have been speculated about in the press, often with some distortion about what the intent of the original comment was. But Netanyahu knows, and he is not going to do anything, I think, that would put in jeopardy the long-term and very significant relationships, far more than people realize, between the United States and Israel, and between Israel and its neighbors, and Israel and other countries that could be impacted by some of the things that we read about in the press.
Well, there certainly have been splits between Israel and American Jewry before. You cited some of the worries of the past. But the truth is, historically, Zionism was a minority movement in the United States until the Holocaust. And in some ways, things are coming full circle with sort of much noisier anti Zionist groups, the sort of intersectional left making a lot of noise. With not not unreasonably saying that they have much stronger support among Jews than they once did. But why do you think it specifically is that Smotrich and Ben Gvir have so many people worried? And do you believe those concerns are justified with respect to issues surrounding religious pluralism, possible changes in the law of return, and other aspects of the religious secular divide? And obviously, we're also speaking on a day when Itamar Ben Gvir went onto the Temple Mount. Now, I would argue that a Jew going there shouldn't blow the whole world up, but that's not how a lot of the world reacts. Do you think that that there is something different about this particular government, which is what some of the people on the left who were certainly willing to condemn Benjamin Netanyahu and every other right wing leader in the past, but now say, well, okay, this is different. Is it different?
It's different because the circumstances change each year with each government. And we have to break down the various components of the things that you asked about. And it's a complex question when you talk about, number one, the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. When Israel was the poor cousin, there was one relationship, much more patronizing dependency relationship. And some people can't adjust to the idea that you have an independent state that is strong, that has the majority of the Jews of the world, that will be independent and will pursue the policies that the citizens voted for. I mean, we respect democracy in every other circumstance, except it seems sometimes when it comes to Israel. I do think that Ben Gvir and others have made unfortunate and sometimes even, let's say, dangerous statements. For instance, going to the Temple Mount, I agree. Jews have a right to go there, but you don't have to make announcements and make it a challenge. He, by proclaiming it in advance, made it a challenge. If he had just gone, he could accomplish the same thing without creating an international incident and having all the condemnations and Netanyahu having to cancel his trip to the UAE, etc. So you have to use the ancient Jewish quality of seichel, of common sense, of judgment about how you do things, when you do them. I think that a lot of this is hype. People are used to coalition governments in which you could have right-wing elements and religious elements and left-wing elements. Now you have a government that was elected, which is predominantly right of center and center right. And we've allowed this mantra to be created that's saying the most extreme, the most right-wing, the most whatever government. Maybe it's true, but I remember when Begin got elected, the language was almost similar and sometimes even worse. Begin, Fagin, you remember some of those
That's true. Well,
things?
I think most American Jews thought that the head of the Irgun had actually been killed in the next to last scene of Exodus. They didn't realize it was a real person who
Right.
was still alive and leading a political party 30 years later.
And could it not have been more moderate? And yet he stood up firmly on issues with Jimmy Carter, with others. I think people have a better perception of that today than they had at the time. And I think Netanyahu was the same. He's had a long relationship with Joe Biden. I've known Biden for more than 40 years. I think Netanyahu has known him almost as long, and was in Washington when Biden was in the Senate. And Biden often speaks about his relationship with Netanyahu and talks about the fact that there are tensions, but there have been tensions between every government. I had that famous exchange with President Obama, which unfortunately they leaked. I did not, and I've never really told the full story. Bibi has a reference to it in his book, but it's not really correct. Where he made some comments, and I said, Mr. President, the lesson of history is that if you have differences with Israel, deal with them quietly, because once you go public, you lock in people's positions. The enemies of both countries will exploit it. That there shouldn't be public daylight. That any chink in the armor of U.S. Israel solidarity, they will drive a Mack truck through it, and etc. And the president turned to me and said, 8 years no daylight, 8 years no progress, meaning the Bush years. And I said, Mr. President, how can you say it? You had the Y negotiation, you had the Barak plan, the Omer plan, you had Gaza disengagement, you had Annapolis. And and he obviously he just looked at me and didn't respond. But at the end of the meeting, he came around the table to shake hands, and we had a very open and meaningful relationship, I would say, throughout his tenure. And so having differences is not the test. It's a question of how you manage them and how you deal with them. I think Netanyahu, you know, did do a challenging thing when he went to the Congress, but as he said, you know, when you're facing an existential challenge, you know, the limits seem to be to the barriers seem to
Referring to the
disappear.
Iran nuclear deal
Right.
and his speech to
and
Congress in
and what he
2015.
thought was an imminent deal that would have really led to a nuclear Iran. And it's debatable about the way it was done, the wisdom and stuff like that. But you know, we have to always react, and it's very easy in hindsight to do things, you know, that you can start putting things. The question is at the moment. So I think Netanyahu will exercise far more control over his government to the degree that he can. The problem is when you have such a narrow margin, every party has leverage beyond its numbers. And I think that that's the case now. So I hope that they would be careful in their words. Is an old Jewish adage that wise people are careful with their words. Words can be more determinant than weapons sometimes. And I think that they're not being careful enough. Nobody wants to see a severance or damage to the diaspora-Israel relationships. I don't know of a minister that I've ever met who said, we don't care what American Jews think. They come here all the time. They listen all the time. There's no government in the world that has that kind of openness that the prime minister, if you look at his calendar, how many meetings he has with diaspora representatives and leaders, I mean, throughout time. So, it's a mutual relationship. I don't think American Jews, and to go to your other point, that you know there is a growing anti-Zionist among some youth and who don't know the history. It's really based on a lot of ignorance too, that we have not educated young people both about the history of Israel, the relationship to true nature, and they get caught up on a campus with the anti-Semitism, the anti-Israelism, the anti-Zionism, and it's very uncomfortable, and sometimes they fall victim to the importunings of a biased professor or a movement, or because they feel uncomfortable and isolated. And our job is to make sure that never happens, that every Jewish student feels safe, can express themselves, that pro-Israel activity should be able to continue. But I think overall that the community remains very committed to Israel. We know the polls are often, when they can find a negative number, it gets blasted everywhere. The positive numbers, which still show overwhelming support, and which still shows the American people support the relationship with Israel. We have to do more to make sure that we solidify that base, that we build coalitions, that we do some of the things we did in the past, and that we work with the government of Israel to help them take the steps necessary to make sure that that relationship remains solid. But I don't believe that anybody takes for granted the diaspora communities. I don't think that they dismiss them. You know, there used to be a term that was used about the denigration of the diaspora. You don't hear that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's certainly true, and I think you're absolutely right about Netanyahu being in charge, and of some of this being exaggerated. However, I think, as with the Ben Gvir visit to the Temple Mount, which again we could argue or not argue the rights and wrongs of it. I mean, he's clearly determined. He and his faction are clearly determined that the examples that you cited before about right-wing Israeli leaders moving to the center, that's not going to happen with this government. I mean, they intend to hold Netanyahu to his word about pursuing a common agenda with them, and I honestly don't think they actually have much to worry about along those lines. But that's certainly their intent. But now let's drill down for a moment on the charges. You referenced them a bit a moment ago about the current coalition being opposed to democracy. Do you think, and so again, as you say, that's the kind of thing that's odd for a democratically elected government. But do you think some of these criticisms, for example, its stand on judicial reform, are justified? Is that an attack on democracy, or is it more democracy, which is what the members of the government would say?
So those are debatable issues, and they need to be clarified. I doubt that 1% of people in America understand any of these issues. I'm not sure that many percent in Israel really understand those issues, and there has to be much more
But I'm
clarity
assuming that
about
both
it.
of us do. So if you could explain it, at least from your point of view, how you think this is going to go.
Well, when you have an activist Supreme Court, it invites reaction, pendulum swing, and in every government. We have had that with our own government as well. But I don't think it's a specific issue. It's the general tone and tenor that is set, and you have to build the confidence of the people that nothing radical or dangerous will take place. Reform is always appropriate if it corrects an anomaly or a situation that is dangerous. I think that there can be debates. We may see some of those issues differently by virtue of our experience in American democracy with what Israel's experience. We don't have a list system. We don't have there's so many differences inherent in it without a constitution, etc. Just as we would have differences with some European countries and others if we were to start comparing the systems, group libel. We don't have group libel in America, but in Europe you do. So fighting anti-Semitism takes on different rules. You can cite many, many examples of it. But the point is that if they're going to exploit it, and if it's going to become just the way most of the American media report these things, which is one-sided, without balance, without context, then every issue is going to become unacceptable or be seen as dangerous or deleterious to Israel and to democracy, to justice. I think the people of Israel are not going to allow their democracy to be undermined. I think they remain as committed, and I speak to a wide range of people. I think many would be hard put to explain what the difference between the last government and most issues and this government. Did they want an Iran deal? Did they want Abraham Accords? I mean, you go down the major issues. That is not to denigrate some of the other issues. I think they are important. I think that we have to make sure they understand our concerns. But Israel has to operate based upon its assessment of its needs. It is a country that has very challenging circumstances. Now, I'm not talking about the domestic issues. I'm talking about more of the international, when people on Ukraine, on other issues, make simplistic judgments when it's a very complex situation for Israel.
Yeah, I think that's true. And my personal belief, and let me know what you think of this, is that I think a lot of this talk about democracy, it's American popular culture is imported everywhere, but now our version of politics, in which the complete bifurcated nature of society, where the two sides, red America, blue America, is just at war with each other, a culture war. I think Israeli politics has always been divisive, but I think this talk about anti-democracy and anti-democratic governments is just kind of importing talking points from from the midterms in this country, and about demonizing political opponents who, as you say, Yair Lapid, what he, his stands, there are a lot of nuances, but they're not really, it's not as if he was really implementing anything all that different, certainly on foreign and security policy, than Netanyahu would do, even with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich on board. This is just sort of a lot of political hyperbole, but political hyperbole has real consequences, doesn't it? When you really start demonizing people and demonizing a government and a country in a way that I think can really do damage to the relationship, if that sort of takes hold as a standard of how we think about something.
And especially for a country in as vulnerable a position as Israel, where the language gets exported, that what may be internal debates or some of the distorted coverage that may take place there, but it becomes the basis for which reporters, who generally are pretty lazy and they're not doing much digging and creative writing of their own, pick up these phrases. And when a minister, will say something, or a leader will accuse Israel of, democracy is in danger, which I've seen, quoted so many times in different forms, that for Israel, this has real consequences in terms of support becoming then a rallying call. You see it manifest in the United Nations, where you get votes, overwhelming votes against Israel on the most spurious of charges. And if you look at the world today, what we've seen in Europe, and I think that, I started speaking about this years ago, that I always look to Europe as a model for America. Not all of Europe, England in particular, not France, but England often is a laboratory for things that come to America, and you can see it in advance. Even BDS, I warned about BDS years before because I saw in Britain how amongst the elites we saw it and then trickled down to society. In France, it's always bottom up. Anti-Semitism is not amongst the intellectuals, but it started to bottom up. England top down. Germany got the worst of both. But if you look at what's happened in Europe, the loss of the political center, the radicalization of politics, the extreme right, extreme lefts, those patterns, which got replicated in our own country, and then every country then gets fit into that mode and try to say, well, you see the radicalization, you see the extreme right, extreme left taking over. I don't think that that's the case. This was a democratic election. Nobody says it was a fixed election. Certainly, the results are not dramatically different in terms of the outcome. So there is a balance, and I always like the broadest coalitions. It makes it easier to face the challenges Israel is inevitably going to face on the economic front, on the domestic front, on the international front. Having a broad coalition is of value, but sometimes the differences really do preclude it. But the people of Israel spoke, and it was a decisive voice. And if you hear on some of the issues that raised, I mean, they're not debating some of the things that we talk about because that wasn't the agenda for them. The agenda for them was the security, job security, the inflation, economy, the COVID, certainly the international agenda is for them the most vital. And their kids are on the front line, and they're paying 50% of their income for taxes. And so I always say that we're not equal partners. We're interested shareholders, but we're not equal partners with the people of Israel. And if people want really to opine, and I think everybody has a right to a view. I think everybody has a right to criticize Israel. That doesn't make you an anti-Semite, or 99% of Israelis would be anti-Semites because they're all criticizing the government of Israel in one way or another.
Most Americans criticize their government
and we
too.
criticize our government too, but
yeah,
we don't do it because we hate it.
Is that
but America
right, the difference is that there's no international movement to eliminate the United States.
Exactly, so, or to deny its right to exist. But I don't dismiss, by the way, the significance amongst young people with some of the ideologies that are being spread amongst them as well. I think it does undermine and endanger America and America's future and the solidarity of the American people. You know, we fight it on a lot of fronts because it is dangerous. And, you know, we had American firsters. You can have a lot of movements that took place in American history, too, that were dangerous to America's self-defense, America's posture, America's standing in the world. And I think, you know, how we're perceived is equally important. You know, often governments make decisions, or leaders, based on perception, not reality. It's the reality is created by the perception. And so if they think Israel is a country divided, or that the American Jews are abandoning Israel and stuff, they will exploit it. And that will, I mean, I even have seen in the last 48 hours comments to that effect saying American Jews are distancing themselves from Israel, coming from Arab sources, hostile sources, who are saying we can exploit it. Even an Iranian source that said it in the last day or so. So it's not without consequence. And that's why I think we have to be careful. I don't say we can't criticize it. We have many opportunities to quietly communicate to the government of Israel, to the leaders of Israel. There's no government that's more open to hearing things than I think the government of Israel. But I don't think the New York Times is the vehicle by which we ought to be communicating with them. You have to be careful. You have to think of the consequences. There are times when public statements are well justified. But you have to think about when people don't matter, don't count, they can say anything they want because it doesn't make any difference. When people have responsibility, if you have clout, if you have the semblances of power, then it really matters.
Yeah, well, that's very true. And I think you're very right about some of the statements about the current government. Petition from, I think over 300 rabbis and institutional people claiming, they wouldn't invite members of the government to speak at their synagogues. Now, it seemed to be mostly virtue signaling because most of those synagogues wouldn't have, Netanyahu there, even if you wanted to go there. And honestly, most of them wouldn't have me there. because they don't really have anybody who isn't left wing speaking on their platforms. But taking a broader view of the issue, most observers, and I think not wrongly, take it as a given that no matter who is in charge in Jerusalem, that there is a growing divide between Israel and American Jewry, especially among young Jews. And I guess the question is, what is the real cause of this? Is it, as some claim, differences over the peace process, the sort of red state, blue state political conflicts, the religious pluralism, or is this really about American Jewish demography and the rise of the group that demographers call Jews of no religion, of people who don't really have a sense of Jewish peoplehood? That's really causing it. Where do you come down on, sort of the eternal question of who's messing up the U.S. Israel relationship?
Well, I think all the things you said are correct. They're all elements of it. I think some people are embarrassed by Jews who stand up for what they believe is important. And, I experienced it at times in the battle in Soviet Jewry and other things where people, when we first did the demonstrations on Fifth Avenue and tens of thousands of people came out, there were those who were opposed to it or who didn't like it. And it wasn't decisions that we made independently. We went through a very difficult process with the Jews in Russia not to do anything to endanger them. And every decision was weighed very carefully. And it was true with regard to Syrian Jew and Iraqi Jews and Iranian Jews and Ethiopian Jews and Yemeni Jews. But look at the result. The result was that those communities are now reunited with the Jewish people and free to a large extent. And was privileged to be part of every one of those and saw from the inside and know the opposition that we sometimes faced for when you stand up. And so that's one factor. It's not the driving factor, I think, in some instances. I think ignorance is. I think distancing that, birthright is very important. I think it's a great project. But you can't ignore kids for the first 17 years of their lives and not educate them and sensitize them and then expect a 10-day trip to radically change things. I think it does have an impact. I do think it's a very positive experience, and all the statistics show it. And I think it'd be very regrettable that it's cut back. But we have to learn about how do we start with the youngest kids. Catholic Church says, give me a kid till he's 60 years old and you can have them the rest of their lives. What do we do? I went to look for my grandchildren for things for 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds on Israel that to start sensitizing. And the fact is, there's very little. And we have to do much more on the internet. We have to create things that are attractive, exciting. I believe in the smorgasbord approach, which means that we should have a broad array across the ideological and religious spectrums. And everybody will find what they identify with. And I did this in building the organizations. I started with Soviet Jewry or JCRC in the President's Conference to try to make sure we always had people there that everyone could identify with, that they look at it and they say, this is somebody who represents my view. And once people get associated, once young people start getting into it, I believe that they will be attracted to the much broader range of what Judaism, Israel, all of this has to offer, what the Jewish community has to offer to them. We haven't made it attractive enough overall. And so one of the prices we pay is distancing from Israel. And Israel has to do a better job. We have to do a better job. The problem is that we face a hostile media that distorts and misrepresents. We face hostile situations on our campuses where it's almost impossible in many places to do pro-Israel activity and to get a fair shake at it. And when you face these kind of overwhelming challenges, we need a unified community that will say we're coming together, we're working together, we're doing it on anti-Semitism today to a much greater degree than in the past, but we also have to do it on the anti-Israel agenda. And it doesn't mean everybody has to march in lockstep. I don't believe in the tic-tac approach where everybody has to have the same house, the same door, the same window. No, there are always going to be differences within the right, differences within the left, differences amongst the affiliated and unaffiliated. But if we start to somehow make the model that you're critical of Israel and that you distance from Israel, you distance yourself from Israel, the distortions have been so wide today. The impact of Farrakhan in the Black community. We see it. Sometimes it's easier to look at other communities and say, look at how these things have become complex language that many of those who say it don't even know that it's an anti-Semitic reference. And I can say one case in particular of a famous TV personality. He did not know what, and he's far from an anti-Semite. It's a philo-Semite, in fact. He has a Hebrew inscription on a tattoo on his neck. And yet he mouthed something without knowing the consequences. Today, young Jews are often mouthing things without understanding the context, the consequences. And I've tested this repeatedly in places where I go to speak and talk to the parents, and I say, go home and at least on Friday nights, on the time when you have dinner with your kids, talk about Israel, talk about the issues, give them a context. So when they get to campus, we have to inoculate them before so that they're able to stand up against the onslaught, rather than, as is human nature, I think, to compromise, to want to fit in, to not be willing to stand up for what you believe, that people are not willing to wear a yarmulke or Star of David, or that's conceding to the anti-Semites and to the pressure that we're under. I know this is a melange of issues, but I think that everything of this is really interrelated to a large degree. And, we have to rethink the allocation of funds and how we use our resources to sustain the broadest spectrum of people. There will always be those who are outside the camp, the chutz l'machane, from biblical times. It was true. It's true today. There are those who just want to be rebels, who want to be against, who have all sorts of reasons, and some may feel that they have justifications. Again, some of the criticism can be justified. You criticized today, I think, implicitly some of the way that Ben Gvir behaved, or others. It's a legitimate thing to do because we see it. They may not see it from our perspective, and our job is to get them to understand it and to put the pressure on all the time about it. But at the same time, we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have to begin to get a much more structured approach, to get curricula, to train teachers. I did a newsletter for high school students on Israel years ago. I could not find anybody to sponsor it, literally no one. And yet there was nothing like it. And after we paid for it for 2 years, but we found that the teachers weren't using it. So we asked them why. They say, because we don't know enough to teach it. So we had to prepare a guide for the teachers for the week before. We sent it to the Hebrew schools and day schools and others for the teachers to be able to teach. So there's a pervasive lack of knowledge. There is too much leeway for people just to take decisions on their own about what they can criticize, what to say, and not think about the consequences of their words. And it can come back in a year, it can come back in a week, but it always comes back.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think you've said a lot that's very valid in what you just said. I think part of it is more than just rebels, in that, to me, one of the things that I've learned in covering the Jewish community, especially in sort of the push for more Jewish education, support for day schools, which are, very effective form of, educating children, before they get to college or before they take birthright. But one of the things that I learned was that even if you make them more affordable, and they're not affordable for most people, certainly middle class Jews, even if you make them more affordable, arguably the majority of Jews in this country wouldn't want to send their kids to them anyway. You couldn't pay them to send their kids to a Jewish school because that's not what they want. They see themselves very differently. And so I think that's a real challenge. That's sort of the Jews of no religion that I referred to before, and that's a really growing element of American Jewry.
But I think you also have to. I do think Jewish education is a key challenge. It's not the subject of our discussion, but it's certainly relevant to it because it's a fundamental that if people don't know why to be a Jew and what the value, what the beauty, and it's I'm very much influenced by the Holocaust. I believe in it, but it's not the essence of Judaism. We have to show them the victory, the celebration, the joy of being a Jew. I mean, to teach them the positives and to give them positive role models from Judaism, and to to make Jewish education affordable is a real challenge, and it should be a collective challenge. We were the first people to institute collective education responsibility. That even before a synagogue, you had to build a school. That, and it says in the Mishnah that you have to, you take responsibility. If somebody can't afford to send their kids to schools, it was collective communal responsibility to do so. And when the Greeks were limiting education to the rich and to the powerful, we were the ones providing it to everybody, the poor and rich alike. So education has always been fundamental to us and critical. And I think you're raising it and the cost of it. But I think that there's a change taking place. I think a lot of people are recognizing that that they would like to give their kids some sort of a Jewish education. It may not be all the same kind, but that they want it. They see that often in the public schools and elsewhere, they're not getting the fulfillment, not even the educational levels that they want is one thing, but also giving the context to their kids, the dangers that they face today, the growing anti-Semitism is making many people, I think, rethink the comfort level that they had before and some of their priorities and what they should be concerned about for their kids and for the society in which we live. And so there may be a clarifying taking place here. It will take time, but unless we make it affordable and unless we make it attractive and we have facilities that are comparable to what they find elsewhere, people will always then look for alternatives. One of the things that you said triggered that, well, it's also a question of the reward that people get for criticizing Israel. They know that they are going to get a headline. Anytime man bites dog, you get a story. Anytime Jewish leader attacks Israel, you can do all the positive things in the world. You can do great things. The Conference of Presidents every day does great things. You're not going to get headlines. But if you say something critical of Israel or Israeli leaders or of the Jewish community, you know you're going to get that. And if you're not going to show people the results of positive activities, and if we're not going to reward them in the ways that our community should, and take notice of young people do remarkable things, others who are doing great things, and that if you simply know that people who do very little for Israel through the year, but they criticize him and all of a sudden become an expert on Israel and get a headline, because the media will always go to them will always take that kind of a comment and give it priority. And there are exceptions to it, and I don't want to make it a blanket charge, but it's the same thing that we saw. I've heard from black leaders about it when they say, we can do a million good things, but all the press then goes to somebody who does an irrational act or an anti-Semitic act or something like that. So we have to also make sure that we properly acknowledge those who are doing the good things, that becomes the standard to which people aspire. Not the negative model where they know that they can get recognition and things by saying anti-Israel stuff.
Now, Malcolm, one of the main concerns of American Jewry, every poll says it, certainly seems to be the way the press treats it, is a perception of a rise in anti-Semitism and certainly in a rise of anti-Semitic attacks. Certainly we face that in the greater New York area, other places. Yet there is no real consensus about what to do about it because people seem only to be able to see anti-Semitism when it comes from their political foes. So people on the right only see it from the left. People on the left only see it coming from the right, or ignoring perhaps African American anti-Semitism, which, as you say, you mentioned Farrakhan, who's an enormous influence, I think, behind some of these controversies, like with the Kanye West and others, and also anti-Semitism from the Muslim world. Why is it so hard? Speaking as someone whose life has been spent trying to unite Jews and together in an umbrella organization. Why is it so hard when faced with this elemental challenge to get Jews to be able to realize that it actually comes from more than one place, and it's not just a political football that they can employ to sort of demonize their enemies and ignore when it's their allies who are at fault?
So, first of all, I do think that there is a change. I think the community is coming together. We saw it with Shining the Light. We see with some of the umbrella organizations have been created to fight aspects of anti-Semitism. We're involved in many projects related to it. I think there is a a growing readiness to confront it. I will tell you that I spoke about the dangers of anti-Semitism for many, many years, for decades. And people come up to me and say, it's depressing. And when I would just give them factual circumstances, this is not something that just happened all of a sudden in the last year, the last 2 years, the last 3 years. This has been growing. There's been an erosion, and there were manifestations of it. Yet people didn't want to confront it. And they would say to me, it's depressing. I said, no, ignorance is depressing. Knowledge empowers, that if you know that there's a challenge to developing, then you can deal with it. But very serious and good people, didn't want to know the reality of this anti-Semitism. So it's not something that just came upon the scene. We've seen leaders who resorted to anti-Semitic language. I think we're more sensitive today. We're more aware of it. We respond to it more forcefully than maybe in the past. We went through very bad periods with Father Coughlin and during World War II, and even in its aftermath. Things that I've been discovering in some of the reading I've been doing, things that we didn't know, but the discrimination that Jews faced. My own father would often get fired on a Friday if he didn't want to work on a Shabbat. He would lose his job, and many Jews, would work for 5 days and get fired and have to look for every Monday for a new job. So there was anti-Semitism and discrimination against Jews that was very pervasive, and we went through a rather glorious period, I guess, with the diminution in the post-Holocaust era, etc. And I think the Six-Day War helped. I think other things helped, the perception of the Jew, the new Jew. But the fact is that in every generation, this was brewing beneath the surface. We say in the Haggadah, B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu, in every generation, enemies arise against us. I'm talking about the Jew hatred. So Rabbi Kamenetsky Zatzal once asked, you mean there was no generation that didn't have it? He said, read the next paragraph in the Haggadah, where it tells the story of Laban, where Jacob was working for his father-in-law, who didn't treat him well, but he was growing wealthy, his family was growing, and he didn't think that he was in danger. And all the time, Laban was plotting against him. So he said that the generations that don't see it manifest openly understand there's always brewing beneath the surface. And now it's coming above the surface again. It's a cancer. It's not something you can eradicate, but you can force it back under the rocks. You can make it unfashionable. You can hold people to account. And I think what happened with Kanye West was very important to set a standard that, you're going to pay a price. You want to be an anti-Semite. It's your freedom of speech is yours, but there's going to be a price to pay. And with Ben and Jerry's and with other instances. But on the other hand, I think we have to be very careful when we use the charge of anti-Semite. I think it has to be the most powerful charge you can use against somebody. And it can't be just thrown around, as you said, on political basis, on other bases, that that the real anti-Semites get off the hook when you start making it too commonplace a charge. So I believe that we are in a position now to mobilize the community, that the resources hopefully will be made available for serious efforts. I'm working with a group of neuroscientists and others who have really doing amazing things that will be manifest, I hope, before long. And many other groups are doing things that are not yet visible, but I think taking it more seriously, approaching it in a systemic way, understanding the motivation, not lumping people together, and that we have to do outreach. I think we should build coalitions like we did in the past, whether it was on Soviet Jewry and before that on the rights issues, with the Asian American community, the Hispanic community, the Black community, and even with the Muslim community. There are many Muslims who do not identify with the extremists in their own communities and feel themselves victims, that when hatred is allowed to go unchecked, everybody becomes a victim. I don't care if you're in the majority or the minority, everybody becomes a victim. So we have to do much more to raise the standard, to get those who are influential. And we did a very extensive study of this a number of years ago. And we try to understand, how do you change people's minds? It's not just a poll. A poll doesn't tell you anything except that moment, that person has a particular view, which can change a second later. But we did in-depth studies. And it showed that young people weren't moving so much to hostility to Israel, let's say, but to indifference, which is for us as big a loss in some respects, as opposed in the political process, you just cancel yourself out. But what we found also is that setting up models like football players, sports stars, movie stars who could talk to young people, them communicating a message against anti-Semitism, against hatred, against bigotry, had much more impact. And we started a program bringing, black football players, non-Jewish football players of all kinds, but also movie stars, sports stars. And when they would come back, the impact was amazing. When the stars of the telenovelas came back, they speak to 100 million people a day around the world. And had big, in Spanish, Us and magazines had big hearts, and it said, "We love Israel." So we have to be more creative. We have to be smarter in how we, fight the battle against anti-Semitism, first within our community and then without. That we have to solidify our stance, and especially getting young people on board, make them feel comfortable. We have to do much more on the security realm, and we created, as you know, SCAN a number of years ago, and now there are others that are joining with it. But SCAN is a nationwide effort with DHS, FBI. We never had that capacity. And it started when Steve Hoffman and I were approached by, I think it was an FBI trainer, and he said, if we told you that that there's going to be a kidnapping of a Jewish leader in Washington State, what would you do? And we just looked at each other because we didn't have the capacity. You might make a phone call, but now we have the ability to reach people, and we have the trainings. And you saw that Pittsburgh, what a difference it made. And in Texas, both the rabbis had the training with SCAN and knew what to do in that circumstance, because then you don't have time to think. So we have to invest much more in the security of our community, especially of our schools. We have to make it a priority. We have to train them. We have to teach them what to do in every circumstance. We have to work with the police, build closer relationships, hold them to account. We have to stop the revolving door justice. I mean, I'm citing these because it's a multi-layer approach that starts in the grassroots of our communities, through the city, the state, the federal levels, getting the IRA definition, which the conference has worked very hard to get in 36 states and many hundreds of universities and others. The legal action that is being taken by Lawfare and others against universities, which does make a difference as a last resort. But when they won't listen, a lawsuit gets their attention. These are only a few of the examples of the many things that can be done by a community that is activated, that mobilizes and recognizes that on this, we have one common stance. There's no differences between left-wing, right-wing, Jewishly identified, less Jewishly identified. They go after people of any kind. It's true, Hasidim or more identifiably Jewish people get victimized first, but nevertheless. And I think that, I, for one, am tired of the memorials to dead Jews. I'm tired of how good the world is at expressing regret. I want them to stand up for living Jews and a living Jewish state. I want that to be the measure by which our elected officials and judicial officials and people in authority of every stand are taken to account. I don't want to be the canary in the mine anymore. We've done that for too long. So it's time when we really hold our elected officials to account where they fail, to expose them for it, where they take the right steps to praise them for it, and to mobilize our own community to know what they have to do, from reaching out and reaching in and assuring that every Jew feels safe.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's entirely true what you say about memorials. Just to drill down a little bit more on that issue before we move on, I think what you say is all very true, but there's been a lot of resistance to sort of some areas of pushback against anti-Semitism, when it comes from sort of politically popular ideologies, like critical race theory, the controversies, the lawsuits. You mentioned lawsuits in California about the way sort of liberated ethnic studies targets Jews and targets Israel and Zionism. That's a fight that not everybody wants to fight, certainly in this country and in American Jewish communities, just because doing so is viewed as inherently political. How do we get beyond that barrier?
You're raising very pertinent issues and challenges. For one, I think people tend to react to those issues on an ideological level, and but don't understand the true consequences. And I've had that experience of asking people, especially about the California curriculum and those things which we have tried to address, and even well-meaning organizations came out, put their names on it. And when I would ask them about it, I saw that they really didn't know the true impact and consequences of it. and what happens, what is inculcated in young people you can't extract it, later on. Once it's in there, and it influences them. You can try to educate, you can try to balance it, but I think that the woke culture, the so many things that are becoming more acceptable are dangerous, and some approach it really with good intention. I mean, I've spoken to people, I think, believe that this is more open-minded and more welcoming. In fact, you have to look at the dangers, potentials of the misuse and the distortions. Freedom of speech is something we will all protect, but we know that there are limits to that too. That you can't yell fire in a theater. You can't just say that anything goes, and that we have to hold to account faculty or others when we can't bring pro-Israel speakers onto a campus, or when a pro-Israel speaker is disrupted and attacked, and they take out the Jews from the room and they leave the attackers and everybody else there, and put the onus on us. Or when I know one university where there were swastikas drawn on a student's doors, several dorm rooms of Jewish students with a very limited Jewish population, the president of the university said, "So move off campus." That wasn't the answer, and it turned out that they had gotten a lot of money from somebody who I think would well qualify as an anti-Semite. And when challenged on it, the president, retracted, and of course the students who were responsible. I got an honorary doctorate at a university, Temple, in Philadelphia, and I got word that there had been an incident in which a Jewish student was badly beaten and put in a hospital for 3 days because he went to a table where they were giving out anti-Israel stuff. And in short, I called the president and I said, "I can't accept this." And he said, "Why?" And when I told him, he was clearly not even aware of the circumstance. And he called me back shortly thereafter, and he said, "I've looked into it, and you're right. I don't know what to say." And they took action against the student who was responsible for the attack. And then I came to the university, and he asked me to come the night before and speak to all the board, all the deans, several hundred people. And I spoke about what it means to take responsibility in the 21st century. And he just stared at me the whole time intently. And when I finished, he came up and he took away the mic from me. And he said, "I never got it till now. I didn't understand it." This is the guy from the Midwest, the most decent person you can imagine. He couldn't relate to it. He didn't understand. And then he called me at the graduation with 13,000 people there to synopsize, what I had said. And I turned to the students and I gave him that message. When you say, it is what it is. No, it isn't. It is what you make of it. And we today take that attitude too much, that, okay, it is what it is. That's the world. It's not the world. The world can be changed. We've changed so many things. When we started Soviet Jewry, nobody believed that 1 million Soviet Jews would be free, that they would make glasnost possible, perestroika possible. When we started on the Syrian Jewry thing, we did demonstrations in the hope of, and nobody believed it. When I did the Iran 13, we had the track record of the first years since 1979 to go against us. And yet they're all home with their families. So there's no obstacle you can't overcome if the community has one precondition met, and that's unity. Throughout our history, the only demand God makes of us for the greatest miracles that occurred from Sinai, where we stood as one person with one heart, to the rescue of Russian Jews and Ethiopian Jews and Syrian Jews, was when we put aside the differences and we stand together. It doesn't mean you erase them. We respect them. You have to create a climate of respect where we can have differences, but more importantly, but where we can act together. There's no enemy. We have one faith and one fate. And too many people divide us, and they have to be held to account. Even when they're in the community or out of the community, we as a community have to hold them to account.
Malcolm, let's turn for a moment to the organization to which you have devoted so much of your life, the Conference of Presidents. As you've stated already, it has many accomplishments on its record, and it serves a really, I think, an important purpose. But in recent years, there have been some open conflicts between groups on the right and on the left that I think, called into question whether any such umbrella group that seeks to encompass the entire political, social, and religious spectrum of American Jewish life can survive in an era where we are so divided by politics. Indeed, some on both the left and the right seem convinced that they'd be better off without trying to work with the other side to preserve even a veneer of Jewish unity. Under these circumstances, how does the conference or any such group so constituted continue to play the role that it's had for the last several decades and had a very productive role? But when everybody's trying to tear it apart, how does that continue to work?
So I spent my career, when I came to New York for Soviet Jewry, before that I worked for the Jewish community in Philadelphia while I was doing my doctorate at Penn. And I worked all the years, then JCRC and President's Conference, in umbrella organizations. It's not easy to work in umbrella Jewish organizations and to build them in the first two cases from scratch and to expand the conference over the years. But I really believe that our strength lies in our unity, that individual organizations can play specific roles, but no organization can meet all the challenges and has the resources to really do what the Jewish community needs to have done alone. But by bringing together and by creating a common table where people of various views and even very stringently different views can come together. And I would say on 95% of the issues, we can find a consensus. And if you identify it, then you expand on it, you build on it. But if you start talking about only what divides us, then it's very hard to come together. And the media wants to see the differences. The headlines and the notoriety comes by those who will take extreme positions and get the notice for it. So I really believe the umbrella organizations are in many respects more important than ever and more relevant. We have to adapt with the times. We change. We have had institutional and other changes, and of course now under the leadership William, Diane, and continue to think I play a role there, and to believe that if the community will only talk to each other through newspaper headlines, we will never succeed. If we're not talking to each other and finding out that, hey, I thought you said this, and that's not what they said at all, but then you have a chance to clarify, you have a chance to create context, you have a chance to share information, I find it can be very salutary. We take them on trips to different countries, and you see the people who are always at odds, at least in the public perception, get together for a week, 2 weeks, travel with each other, and bond together and end up in very positive and friendly relationships, which is one of the benefits of doing it, aside from exposing them to the circumstances around the world. 99% of what the conference has done over the years was not public. I did not believe that you get known for what you say you did, but what you do. And that should speak for you. Because too much of this is a race for headlines, a race for coverage, and I understand people need it to raise funds, to other stuff, but I don't think that creates credibility. And too often then, people have competing headlines, which then pits them against it, and they have to justify it, and it gets deeper and broader as it goes along. So I hope that we can, especially in the crises that we face today with antisemitism, with so many of the issues, the financial crises, et cetera, that people put aside some of those differences and think about the common agenda, the common needs, because the sum of the parts, the whole, is far greater than the sum of the parts alone. That what we can do as a community, and this has been true throughout our history, is far greater than what the individual components can accomplish. And at the same time, I think there has to be accountability. And the question that you raised suggested that there has to be accountability for people who do irresponsible or say irresponsible things. You shouldn't just be able to get away with it. But we are a nation. The first one to call us a nation was Pharaoh. We shouldn't let our enemies define us. We should be defining ourselves in a positive way as a community that has great resources, great history, great assets. We see a war declared against the Jewish people today, against the Jewish history, against the Jewish past, which they try to rewrite and deny, against the Jewish future. And it's only collectively that we can address that.
Yeah, well, in recent years, you've devoted, I know, a considerable amount of effort to trying to create more unity, bring Jews together on issues where they can work together. And so I guess, sort of the question is, where does that stand now in an age where we're more divided than ever, with increasingly fewer Jews even thinking there is any value in preserving the pretense of unity? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of American Jewry under such, divided circumstances where we really are, sort of in the middle of a political culture war for the Jews as much as anybody else?
I've been trying to do it for the last 50 or more years. So you're right. There's a long track record, and there are always mountains and valleys in that battle that people came together in 67 in unbelievably remarkable ways. For Soviet Jewry and for these other causes, we show that it's possible, that it can be done still. And I am still optimistic because people care about the world of their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I think they understand that what they do today helps determine that world. And decisions that we make today are not about days or months. It's about generations. And one of the things I point out, that the change from 80 years ago is not that the world has changed. It's not a more caring place. You see anti-Semitism, you see the hatred, you see the terrible things being done to people around the world. The difference is, for Jews, is that we have a state of Israel, and that we have an IAF, an IDF, etc. So communities that were written off today have a place to go. I'm sorry. The difference in the battle is the existence of the internet. Where it took Hitler months to spread a big lie, you can do it today in nanoseconds. And that you have state sponsors, the PA, Iran, others. And we're fighting an invisible battle, enemy, because it operates in the dark web, but it's pervasive influence. You see influencers whose names we don't know, who have no background, no education, no specific quality, but 30, 40 million people follow them and wait on every word that they say. So the nature of the battle has changed a lot and requires us to become far more sophisticated in our use of the internet and in social media and the technologies, and to be ahead of the curve. And that requires a lot of resources, a lot of effort, and a collectivization of the effort, because nobody can do that alone. And there are remarkable things being done. We have to do much more of it.
Well, that's a good way to end this. Malcolm, thanks so much for coming on today.
No, it's my
For
pleasure.
your insights on these really important issues. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.